Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, coming at you with another fantastic guest today. And let's do the usual housekeeping off the top. I've been just blessed with some great guests recently. Leo Stone from Aficionado, um, Carl Giannone from Trade Roots in Massachusetts, Travis Cesaroni, who I'm talking with about a part two right now, uh, Chris Hudala, Dr. Chris from Pro Verde Labs in Massachusetts, Wolf Siegel. And since my man is trying to hit 100 views, let's go with Kyle Sheridan from Sunny Gardens here in Vermont. And I have a number of excellent interviews coming up for you guys. On Tuesday, the 2nd, I got my man Rich Williams, who I met when I was doing stand-up comedy. And you guys know I like to mix it up a little with some of those interviews. So Rich will be joining me. He's just a fucking super funny guy and a super talented performer. I can't wait to have Rich on the show. On Thursday, I've got Pilar de Jesus, who is involved with the National Expungement Week and some other different advocacy groups. I'm super pumped to have Pilar on the show. I got on the 9th, I got Keith Stroop, who's the founder of Normal or Strupp. I'm not sure how you say that, but I got Keith coming on the show. Yeah, and we could just leave it right there. That's pretty good for now. My guest today, we met on LinkedIn. And according to his bio, works at the intersection of cannabis cultivation and regional agriculture in the Northeast. He's an attorney, and he is the general manager at Hepworth Pura, a New York adult use conditional processor. Please welcome to the show, Suehiko Ono. Hey, Suehiko, thank you for being here today, man.
Thank you, Caleb.
Yeah, Caleb. Yeah, it's cool. And please, before we do anything serious, would you mind giving us a 5-minute life story?
5-minute life story. Okay. Have to look at my clock there. So I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, where I live now, Western Mass, Berkshire County, right in the middle of the North-South. But I grew up in New York. My parents were hippies of the era. Father was a potter. My name Suehiko means son of pottery. And let's just say, skip fast forward to sort of how we came to be in this conversation a little bit. After growing up in New York, I went to SUNY Albany for undergrad, studied philosophy. Right after college, I went to go live at Gulch Farm, which was a Zen monastic community right outside of California. It was also not only a Zen community, but an organic farm. And so during that time, I went there in 1999 when I graduated from college, lived there for 2 years, and my eyes were opened to the importance and value and significance, salience of agriculture. So after 2 years at Green Gulch Farm, I went to UC Santa Cruz, Center for Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems, for their 6-month agroecology apprenticeship program. And then from there, came back to New York, started a CSA farm in Ossining, New York. Teatown Lake Reservation was a nature preserve, and I teamed up with them to really start to explore more ways of helping to make agriculture, or let me rephrase that, trying to find creative ways to make small agricultural businesses work. And this was an attempt at using a nonprofit nature preserve as essentially a land subsidy. From there, that experience led me to law school, where I went to and studied most of my time there, thinking about organizational structure and how human beings might use the existing organizations that are given by the state in order to organize human beings in different ways. From there, that led me to a relatively, very short career as a corporate tax attorney, Graduated from law school in 2007, so went right into the financial industry as a tax attorney when the economy more or less collapsed. You all remember 2008, the Great Recession. So from there, I went to Sedona, Arizona to study martial arts. Um, been all over the place. Yeah. So lived in Sedona for 10 years. And in order to support my martial arts habit, I sold timeshare. From there, always thinking about agriculture, and came to Massachusetts, let's just say sight unseen from Arizona, excuse me, after 10 years. My wife and I put our house on the market, packed our kids up, 2 U-Hauls, came across the country to start EOS Farms in Massachusetts. We were the fifth of the licensed outdoor cultivators in Massachusetts, and so therefore in the Northeast in adult use, recreational. And was very interested going back to my days in agriculture in the intersection of cannabis and local farms, regional farms. EOS Farms, which we, let's say, signed our lease, got our commence operations at the end of 2020, first season 2021. Um, and it is still operating. However, in end of 22, I moved on from there and joined Hepworth Pura. Hepworth Pura is in Milton, New York, just just south of Poughkeepsie. Um, and we are a conditional adult use processor and cultivator. And so that's where I am today.
Can we, and here, hold up. I'm going to put you in the big box. Could we back that up a step? And I'd love to ask you about, you mentioned martial arts. I would love to hear a little bit about that and living in like a monastic community or something like that. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
fascinating to me.
Yeah. So the monastic community was 1999. So that was 2 years. That was Zen. That was different. So then fast forward 2008, right? So Zen, farming, law school, then was an attorney. 2008 came, and let's just say my life more or less fell apart around that time. Same time the economy collapsed, and went out to Sedona to study martial arts in a tradition called Shinkage. It's a 16th, 17th century Japanese samurai tradition, right? Everyone's heard of that, I believe. And so I met my teacher on an airplane, my first year of law school, and started training with him, and have been interested and in and out, to varying degrees of seriousness in martial arts for my entire life, off and on. And so in 2008, I moved to Sedona specifically to train with my teacher, a guy named Hunter Armstrong. And for 10 years, I lived in Sedona, and we trained very seriously, religiously, really. For the 10 years I was there, 5 to 20 hours a week, consistently, for 10 years until I left in March of 17. So it was very traditional Japanese battlefield system, all weapons and traditional garb and what have you.
Oh, okay. I'll pop back in here. Cool, man. And the other thing you mentioned was EOS, which, and I'd like to run through some of your businesses here. And EOS Farms, you said maybe this was the fifth licensed outdoor cultivator in Massachusetts.
Yeah, yeah. So
could you please give us a little take on what it took to set up that business, and and we're going to dig into the regulatory frameworks here too, so I'd love to hear how that went for you.
Sure. Yeah. So again, what really interests me about cannabis, I mean, among other things, I love weed. I've smoked weed my whole life, off and on. Um, almost whatever I was farming, I was also growing weed. In the Northeast, I mean, I don't know statistics, but most of the farmers that I know in the Northeast, allegedly, were all growing weed in order to make ends meet on farms. And so it's always an integral part. And so I was very interested in this intersection for a number of reasons. And one of the main reasons is finding creative, strategic ways to help farms become or maintain successful economic financial viability. And so 2017, so I was kind of watching regulations for recreational cannabis as they would come out. And I was really interested in the Northeast in particular. It's where I'm from, but there's also, there's just a lot of cultural reasons why I think it's a powerful place to really engage in this conversation. So when Massachusetts opened up they issued their proposed regulations in November, I believe, 2017, and I read them, and the light bulb went off. And like I said, by March of 18, I told my teacher what I intended to do. He actually gave me an ultimatum, and that was either don't do that or you can't train anymore. So sadly, that was really the last conversation I had with him after 14 years. Packed up our house, put it on the market in Sedona. Beautiful house. We had just finished renovating it. My wife and I, our 2 kids. Packed up everything we had in 2 U-Hauls, more or less sight unseen, to come and start a pot farm in Massachusetts. And we were very contrarian at the time. The few conversations I was able to have to raise money, most of the investors, private equity, venture capital, family offices, they were convinced that you can't grow cannabis outside in the Northeast. So it was very, very difficult, actually impossible to raise, money from the sources that were putting money into cannabis at that time. So we came out, started cold calling farms, and eventually found Bittersweet Farm in Pittsfield, where I happened to have been born. Didn't grow up there, didn't spend any time there, but that's where a farm found, and that's where we ended up. I could go on and on. I mean, so
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so 2019, we finally, after pounding the pavement, finding a farmer who was, open and willing. Most of the farmers that I talked to, they were probably of the, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 farmers that I called in Massachusetts, some of which just hung up on me. And then probably a handful, half a dozen were interested in having a conversation. Finally found a local farmer in Pittsfield.
What?
And
Can I ask you a question?
yeah,
Why do you think they hung up on you? Do you have any idea why that might have happened?
yeah. Well, same reason why cannabis is weed, pot, marijuana, whatever the case may be. It's a very charged conversation, right? It's one of the reasons why I think it's very interesting and powerful and important. And it's charged for a lot of reasons, and it's got the post prohibition hangover, and a lot of farmers tend to be can sometimes be very conservative, right? And so
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? The post prohibition hangover? Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it seems cannabis is one of those things where there are very strong opinions, because as we all know, prohibition brought with it a lot of incredible amount of propaganda. And anyone in this conversation, Caleb, I know you, most of the people you've ever talked to, we know the culture and the background and the history, and quite frankly unfounded, right? For years, let's just go back to the Controlled Substance Act, but even before that, right? But the attempt to demonize, right? I mean, I actually grew up with, just my again, going back to my family were hippies, and so I grew up, and my mother was always exposing me to how there was an alternative way of looking at cannabis, or marijuana at that time, right, or pot or weed, and it wasn't as clearly evil as it seemed to have been made out to be, right, by popular culture. And and despite years and years of effort to try to demonize cannabis and show how terrible it is, and you and I have spoken about this, it seems to me that what we have shown is that it is extremely benign. And in many cases, There's a lot of reason to believe that it has a lot of healing properties, and not just medicinally, but spiritually, culturally, right? It brings people together. There's a lot of incredible value that it has, with downside and trade-offs, no doubt, but still, benign. And so, despite this, right, because of various political, economic, various reasons that I think we all understand, there's a lot of propaganda, right? And people were made to fear cannabis as though it was the so-called gateway drug or whatever else came up as the so-called justifications. And so a lot of people bought into that, right? They believed what the police officers and teachers told us in the DARE programs, right, when we were growing up. And so they, there was a fear, and it's hard for people to change their minds, especially when something gets repeated often enough. It's just the nature of our minds that we believe it. So
Oh,
it's hard to change.
that's the hallmark of any good propaganda campaign, is to
Indeed.
repeat and repeat.
Indeed.
No.
Yeah. So
Carry on. Yeah,
yeah,
sorry to
so
interrupt you.
no, not at all, not at all. So as a result, a lot of the phone calls that I had, didn't get past many sentences. There were people who were very, very opposed to it, and I would say not a lot, but oftentimes people who weren't necessarily growers, farmers who weren't necessarily opposed to cannabis themselves were concerned about how their consumers, how their customers might view them if they grew cannabis. And so that was actually a response that I heard quite a bit. Right, we don't want our, whoever the case may be, to look at us and think that, and stop giving us their business because of us growing cannabis, in addition to the cattle or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and I would like to I would like to ask you about your partner. It sounded like you had a very interesting partner with a great backstory, and I was wondering if we could hear a little about that.
Are you talking about at EOS?
No, I don't know. Something about a recon sniper.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so in this twisty turn of events that, when I look back, now in retrospect, I say that the very divergent things that I've done kind of come down to effectiveness and well-being. But maybe we'll get back to that. When I was in Sedona training, my teacher gave a course on close combat mindset training. It was called at the time CTAP, combative training for the armed professional. And one of the groups that would come through was the Marine Corps, and there was one in 2009, I believe. And a good buddy of mine, we'll call him Trav for now. He came through there in 2009, and we became very close. We became very good friends. And over the years, we trained together. And he was a recon MARSOC scout sniper, very, very well trained, very experienced Marine Corps. And when we came out, there were a few things. The way I was kind of approaching this was, I had never been in cannabis as a profession, in the so-called, licensed regulatory cannabis world before this, which actually was one of the reasons it was very hard for me to raise money, because I did not have the track record. But the way I looked at it was, there were a few areas that I really wanted to understand, and we wanted to execute these things very well without knowing, because we were going into a brand new state, new regulatory framework, a lot of unknowns, and into a place that we didn't know people. So we didn't have the existing ties into the community. And so one of the people, it was sort of this basic belief that I still maintain, that the foundation of human beings' ability to accomplish anything, and also to be happy and to have well-being, is within groups of people that have close-knit bonds and trust and loyalty. And Travis was that, to the T. And so when I first came out, he was the third person, actually. The first person was actually put together from a friend of a friend, the world of finance and accounting. But Travis had the background in and a lot of things that I didn't understand at the time, but a really deep understanding of how to get teams to work together, logistics, and problem solving, and of course, compliance and security. Um, Now, in retrospect, we actually overdid it in security, but we wanted to be in a position, and this was 2018 in Massachusetts, where Massachusetts was very, very strict in their regulatory framework. Yes, sir.
What do you mean you overdid it with security? Could you explain to us what you meant by that?
Yeah, yeah. So, again, 2019, we were the fifth of the licensed outdoor cultivators, and there was a lot of let's say there were so many rumors and stories about the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts, and they were extremely strict, and they were issuing all kinds of notices of deficiencies and fines and what have you. Right now, that has changed over the years, but back then it was extremely strict. And so our approach was we wanted to make sure that we got through, and also, one of the biggest complaints is that the licensing process back then was just taking so long, and people were getting hung up with various notices of deficiency. They didn't have the camera in the right place, or a hyphen in the right place, or
Is,
whatever the
is
case may be.
Is that some of the deficiencies, like your camera isn't in the right place? Like,
Yeah, back then, there were people got held up for months because they didn't have enough cameras. Or we got one of the notice of deficiencies that we got was the corporate name had a hyphen in it, and we didn't put a hyphen. And so after weeks, months of waiting to get responses, we got a notice of deficiency because the name didn't have the hyphen that was in the public record, right?
huh?
Yeah, yeah. So because of that, we were thinking, okay, two things. Travis, who had a real experience in making physical uh, places safe, right? He knew what that meant, and so we made it safe. Used top of the line security and surveillance equipment, um, and then we also wanted to make sure that we were not going to get a deficiency. That the CCC would come, look at us, and we would be like the gold standard, right? That, wow, this is how you keep a outdoor cannabis facility safe and locked down. No one's going to steal anything. And so that was kind of the approach, but we overdid it. I mean, $800,000 into security equipment, not necessary. Especially because we were sort of, we overvalued some of the risk. We didn't know anybody, didn't really know the area, didn't know how much we had to worry about
Mm,
crime. We had heard the stories of people getting robbed at gunpoint in California, right?
yeah.
And so we were making it so that those things were not going to happen. We could have tens of millions of dollars of cannabis right on site, and it would be safe. And that was the approach. But knowing what we know now, we could have done it for a fraction of the price. So things like that, right? Going through it and realizing that it didn't have to be that safe.
Mm, okay.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on. It sounds like you have a lot of experience in Massachusetts as well as New York. And I've interviewed a couple people from Massachusetts, and also Joseph Calderon, Stephen Houghton, Paula Collins, Brad Racino from New York. And I'd be curious on your thoughts on the regulatory frameworks between those two different states.
Hmm. Um,
I know that's a lot. Yeah.
that is a lot. Yeah, the difference between the two regulatory frameworks. So, okay, I'll give you an example, right? So I kind of we just talked about how in 2018, 2019, I was, we were just, I mean, there was a story, and this is all public information. There was a fine, right, for MCR Labs, 200. It was originally $500,000 because they disposed of 3.5 grams of cannabis incorrectly into a dumpster that wasn't locked, and it was reduced, to 250, right? Crazy. And so it was,
Wow.
everyone was just on edge. And it was 2
Did
years.
you say did you say MCR Labs?
Yeah.
No shit.
Yeah,
Okay.
way back in the day. Yeah, if you Google it, this was like early days. It was complete nonsense. It was nonsense. You
Yeah,
know,
and I
MCR
just had
Labs, MCR Labs, they are the absolute pinnacle of professionalism. They know what they're doing. They can
mm,
navigate, right? They're honest. They're good people, and they got slapped with this ridiculous fine.
peace to
You know,
Chris Hudala too. I just had Chris on the show a couple of months ago, maybe, and he
yeah.
seems like a great guy.
Oh yeah, no, they're awesome. Yeah, Michael Kahn, yeah, all of them. John Wani, they're amazing. They're amazing,
Okay.
and they're in New York. And that's the thing is like the Massachusetts was just so strict, and people were just in the queue provisional licensing for years, frankly, years. And so fast forward now, I leave Massachusetts and I'm looking at New York, and New York. The way New York opened up is they gave what was called a conditional licensure period. And essentially, long story short, what they were trying to do was help the hemp growers that were licensed in New York that got crushed for a number of different reasons. And that was just a debacle for many reasons. And so what New York did is they said, okay, we're going to give first mover advantage to the hemp licensed cultivators. And if they were a licensed cultivator, I believe it was for 2 of the previous 5 years in hemp, or a processor, then they could apply for a conditional cultivator or a conditional processor license in New York. That was essentially a very, very simple filing, an application that was compared to, again, talk about the regulatory framework compared to Massachusetts,
Uh,
was like nothing. And so you put in this application, and then you could then grow up to an acre, 40,000 square feet outdoors in New York, and you had to have minimal security and compliance and tracking, right? But it was basically have at it. So when I came and saw some of the farms in New York, I was shocked, right? After I just explained, we had $800,000 of security equipment, recon scout sniper. I mean, we had SOPs, we had relationships with all of the emergency services around us. I mean, we were like locked down. We had all of our facilities, all, brand new. I mean, it was very, very compliant. And then you fast forward to New York, I basically almost bumped, almost drove accidentally over some of the plants just because it was just a completely different world. And so now we're actually getting in New York to the end of the conditional licensure period. And it's going to be interesting, right? Because in this period, the during the time when the conditional licensure and the conditional license operators were operating beginning in 2022 through currently, the adult use regulations in New York became they were actually put into force in September of 23, in the middle of this. So now the regulations come into effect and they are the law, but the, let's say, level of compliance of these operators is less than 100%. And so it's going to be interesting. And the OCM has been, well, just up to their neck. They're understaffed and overworked and and under a lot of pressure and a lot of fire. And so compliance has been very interesting and less strict, let's say, than in Massachusetts.
I was going to ask you, how does your I assume you maybe communicate with the regulators in these states, since you're an attorney and you're involved in this industry. I was curious, how your communications have gone in Massachusetts compared to New York.
Um, hmm. It's an interesting question. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So my experience has been, again, now some of the people in OCM I had existing relationships with just because they've been in the industry. So, for example, um, Brian Farmer. So I'm very interested in outdoor cannabis, right? Outdoor cannabis cultivation on farms, and one of the historical examples I look at is certification, right? Third party certification, in particular, which then became USDA organic. But I was more interested in third party. Well, I back when we started EOS, we got certified by the Cannabis Conservancy, and they work in California. They're also connected with Sun and Earth, you know, Dr. Bronner's or David Bronner's
Yeah.
organization.
I talked to them
Yeah,
recently too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so Brian Farmer was the one who founded that. And I became, you know, I started working with Brian to get our certification at EOS Farms. Brian then moved on and he became part of the OCM, first as the chief of compliance. Now he works in the chief equity office. Or yeah, I believe that's the name of the office, but with Damien Fagan, the chief equity officer, and he works in that office.
Well,
And they were always,
Damien's on suspension, I think, right? Didn't he
yeah,
just?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he was, you know, and again, this is, it's a very volatile and very emotionally charged industry. Um, I found from them is they were very, very accessible. And CCC is also accessible. You know, I still am in communication with them about various aspects of the regulations. I've been very involved in parts
What
of the
is
regulations.
what is the CCC? Is that a New York agency?
No, sorry. CCC is the Cannabis Control Commission. That's the Massachusetts agency.
Oh, okay.
OCM is the Office of Cannabis Management. That's the New York agency. And
Thank you.
so the CCC, which is under, they're also under fire, right? And so they've also become a lot more lax in their compliance, just because, you know, they're actually, yeah, they've been, well, say what it is, they're kind of falling apart. Um, and but there are people within the CCC, the commissioners, they're all very accessible, and you know the current existing commissioners and genuinely want to help. You know, and I find this to be true of all of them. You know, in either the OCM or the CCC, they genuinely want to help, but more often than not, they truly just don't understand the industry. And the OCM is actually a little different. Brian Farmer knows this industry better as well as anybody. He's somebody you should talk to.
Brian.
Yeah,
Brian, if you're listening, come on the show, man.
Yeah.
Oh.
But for the most part, you know, a lot of the regulations are written, again, let's just, you know, give everyone the benefit of the doubt, and they are designed to try to help the consumer and the public. And they believe that, and that's what they're trying to do. But it's very difficult, and there's a lot of moving pieces. And what tends to happen is, you know, from the standpoint of an operator, I would see how the regulations would come into direct conflict and tension with operations.
Do you have an example of that?
Sure. Yeah. So the first part that I recognize, again, everything that I talk about and do in cannabis in New York and Massachusetts can be understood in terms of my interest in the intersection of cannabis and local agriculture. Okay. And so one of the first things, so I'm interested in so-called regenerative. And back, you know, when I was at Green Gulch and UC Santa Cruz, it was organic agriculture. That was when organic was still meant something, before everyone knew about it and when it was still cool, before the USDA took it over. And we used to call it organic. Now it's regenerative, whatever the case may be. But it's basically, it has to do with a respect for the land, cycling of resources, right? Regenerative is now a good term because what it talks about is regeneration of the biological and, you know, organic, uh, uh, ecological integration of the farm with the ecology, right? The surrounding biology and plant life, and in such a way that replenishes the land versus just completely extracting from the land, right? And so, with those things in mind, one of the strategies that you use in the regenerative side of agriculture is you want to encourage biological activity. You want to inoculate the plants in both the foliage and in the soil with microbiology. And we're talking about hundreds, thousands of species of bacteria and fungus and protozoa and amoeba and all these other organisms, right, that live in symbiotic relationship. It is an adaptive trait, an adaptive strategy that all living organisms have utilized through evolution to become more healthy and ecologically integrated. And so what happens, unfortunately, is if you are supporting and doing everything you can to cultivate biological activity, uh, so-called beneficial microbes, bacteria, and
Oh,
fungus.
you're going to do my next transition for me. I can feel it right now.
Yep. Well, then what you see is in many states, and let me be clear, I'm very in favor of testing the final product for contaminants that can be shown to cause harm to human beings. So things like heavy metals, pesticides, right? Very important to test for these things. And even bacteria and fungus that have been shown to cause harm, even aspergillus, but that's even a difficult conversation. But what we test for in almost every state, and New York, and here's another difference between New York and Massachusetts, but in Massachusetts, we have an action level, a so-called pass-fail action level for total yeast mold and total viable aerobic bacteria. And those two tests, which many call a indicator test, they don't differentiate between the various species of bacteria and fungus. And so what happens is if I'm inoculating my plant with beneficial fungus and bacteria, then it will fail for those tests. And so what then happens is you're either left with either sell and remediate. And let's be clear what remediation means. Remediation or sanitation through any of the various means, whether it be extraction through ethanol or butane or one of the other hydrocarbons, right? Or whether we're talking about going through any of the various technologies for flour.
But so you would lump hydrocarbon extraction also into the remediation category.
All of those are remediation.
Yeah,
that's what remediation is, right?
Carry on.
Remediation of a contaminant. Now, the problem is the contaminant is a word that's defined in the regulatory framework, and it's defined by people who didn't quite understand what they were regulating. And so what happens here is you take the total yeast mold, total viable aerobic bacteria, which is it is required that you pass that in the state of Massachusetts based on an action level. And the history of that also is not, let's say, strictly scientific, right? A lot of culture, a lot of repetition, a lot of, just continuously kind of repeating what we've heard without challenging first principles. And so we get this framework that was given to us by the state, which comes into direct conflict with outdoor biologically sound growing practices. And so then we're left with a choice. You're either growing for cannabis that if you're going to bring it to market, it has to be remediated, meaning you have to sanitize it, meaning you have to kill the microbial activity or microbial life in the plant, right? And that's an ongoing conversation throughout food and agriculture and the FDA, and even take the arguments that you hear. And I don't really take a position necessarily. People should be able to have the freedom to do what they want, but whether you're eating raw or pasteurized milk, right? It's very similar conversation and very similar framework and very similar points of view, I would say.
Well, how do you feel about the an issue that's been raised to me a lot is the issue of labeling products that have been remediated. So like your milk is pasteurized and it says, hey, this has been pasteurized. Do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of information, transparency, right? But information and transparency does presuppose a lot of information and transparency, right? And so we have to be careful about labeling. And what I would like to see actually is everything with a QR code. And in that QR code is the full panel of everything, right? Full disclosure. But I would like to see everything that the state measures. I want to see how much carbon was used, the electricity that was used, the amount of plastic that was wasted. And these are all things that are measured by the state of New York, for example, that we have to report. So I want to see a QR code. And if we're truly giving all of the information, I'm down for that. But when you're talking about the packaging and the label, anyone who has actually gone through the headache of trying to design packaging, when you're trying to take in all the characteristics of the branding, the art, all the compliance requirements, which, by the way, most of these requirements that are actually required for us to report do two things. They mislead us with bullshit and have us focus on the wrong shit. But what we put on the label is what we focus on. So why does everybody tack hunt? Well, because everybody requires that you put the THC. You can't look at the product. You can only look at THC. So what do? We tack hunt because that's what the regulatory framework drives us to believe is the truth, quote unquote.
You can't look. You said you can't look at the product. Is that
in like Yeah, yeah. Well, and so there's, there are variations, but most the packaging, it cannot be, it has to be opaque. You can't see through packaging in Massachusetts, for example.
Even
Now,
for
New York, what?
flour? I had Carl Giannone on. I thought he showed me a picture of a bag where you could actually see through it. But yeah, I did go to a dispensary in Massachusetts, and there was nothing on display. It
Right,
was just like
right.
an
Now you
office.
can also, so they can do smell displays, right? They can do displays, but the packaging has to be opaque. You cannot see through the packaging itself. And
Okay.
so there are ways around this, don't get me wrong. And so, really
Uh,
creative operators, they're going to try to show you the flower in some cases because they want some other characteristics, right? So, again, but here's my point, and your question was about labeling for, let's say, because this is an ongoing conversation, and I know Carl disagrees with me vehemently on this topic, but the question of whether or not we should label remediation, right?
uh
Okay,
And also, could we dive into a little bit about the different types of remediation? Because I know you said you had researched all the different types, and some of those I didn't even know existed until last year when I went to Vegas for MJ BizCon.
right, right, yeah. So, and that, and that's the other thing, right? If we're labeling it, are you labeling exactly the type of remediation? At what stage of the cultivation process? What is actually remediation mean? Right? So all of these are questions that we sort of take for granted at face value, as though these are clearly set, defined terms that have a scientific basis, that are obvious to all of us. Now, I am a big fan of full disclosure. So, like I said, I want to see a QR code that brings us to all of the information, the full panel testing. Now, keep in mind, right? The testing, you cannot be certain that that is, let's say, accurate across labs, across the same plant. Anyone who's ever done a test, that the THC content, again, what everybody's looking for, the difference between the top cola, the difference between that and going on down various parts of the plant, it's going to be fundamentally different. But we have a testing protocol. You can test 15 pounds in some states, 50 pounds, whatever the case may be. You take the top cola and then you take the trim, that bullshit, you put it in, you put it in a pre-roll, and you're selling 28% THC, pre-rolls, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so all of this to
I've
say,
seen I've seen numbers way higher than that too.
exactly, exactly. So all of this is to say, right? Labeling is important, but it's about informing and not misleading the consumer, giving them the full information so that they can make choices. That I'm for. But that has to come with conversations, and that comes with nuance. And nuance is not what, we don't live in a culture of nuance anymore.
Well,
Everything is,
that's what we're doing here right now, Suehiko.
yeah. And I
Uh-huh.
appreciate that, Caleb. I do.
Yeah, so tell me, in your research, and I had Carly Bader on from Willow Industries. I've talked to Matt Brocksterman from Rad Source. Trying to get in touch with the guys from Zeal who do the RF remediation. Have you done any type of research on this? And what have you found in your readings, if you've done any?
Yeah. So first off, I did not do anything resembling scientific research, but I did, let's say a deep dive into the research one can find on the internet, and it's available to everybody, right? Across the various types of, remediation techniques. And whether we're talking about the extraction remediations, right? Ethanol or butane or, or let's say ozone, uh, radio frequency, whatever the case may be. And when I started looking at this, because again, I was interested in outdoor cannabis, and I was interested specifically in biologically active regenerative farming practices, right? We were making compost tea and inoculating our plants with beneficial microbes that were helping the plants survive and thrive, right? And so I recognized this as a problem. And then when we grew some test runs out in Massachusetts, and we grew immaculate cannabis, right? Beautiful, beautiful. And we took it to MCR labs, and we failed for total yeast mold and total viable aerobic bacteria,
Oh,
as
shit.
expected, right? Beautiful. I mean, beautiful cannabis. And so
Was
we failed.
Massachusetts also like pass fail for?
Yeah,
Yeah,
pass
okay.
fail, pass fail. Yep. And so what I brought into the lab, just in my own research, it failed. So I was like, oh, okay, well, we got a problem here. And so I started by writing a petition to the Cannabis Control Commission to change the microbe testing thresholds, and we make, and we're going at the pace of regulatory, legislators. And what that means is that I submitted that 2019, I believe, and the OCM is still, or the CCC is still thinking about it, right? They're still researching it. And so, now, uh, here I am, and I'm thinking, okay, well, we want to grow, we want to use these practices, and what are we going to do? And so we started looking at the various ways people throughout the industry have been remediating, right? Passing these total microbe, total yeast wall, total viable aerobic bacteria. And so through my research, I looked at the various techniques. And what I found was that the arc irradiation, right, the X-ray, the there's a few manufacturers. The one I have direct experience with is RadSource. And what I found was that was 100% effective, deeply effective, used throughout various industries, food industry, pharmaceutical, medical.
All right,
They used to purify.
Matt told me they used to do blood.
Yeah.
They would run it through because they were finding radioactive particles in blood or something like that, which I thought was a super fascinating little piece of science.
Well, so I'm not sure about the radioactive particles in blood.
I think that's what he told me. And please, Matt, if I'm wrong, please correct me tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah. So and this is actually one of the benefits, is that just like an X-ray, right? If you go to the dentist and you get an X-ray, there is no residual radiation as soon as you turn the X-ray machine off. Now, when it's on, you want lead. You want to be covered. It goes through your face. It's going to go through. And what happens is it has so much energy, and it can go through all of your muscles and organs that it can damage the cells and cause cancer, right? But once you turn it off, all that energy is gone. It's based on a frequency. And so gamma radiation is one that's used often, and that is actually used with radioactive material. And it's a higher frequency, higher frequency, high energy. And it's the most, gamma is the highest. X-ray is a little lower energy. And it's designed specifically to sanitize meaning killing all microbial life. And so what it does in blood is make sure that the blood is completely sanitary. There is no foreign microbial activity, right? That's what it does. Now, what it also does in all kinds of various biological and plant matter is it can go right through it and sanitize it. And that's what it does. And when it turns off, there is no residual effect. Now, one of the arguments, and this is essentially how the argument goes, we have not proven that there is no long-term residual effect to radiation, to arc irradiation, to X-rays. We have not proven that there isn't some long-term effect. And so therefore, we want to label it. Now, that is actually a very unscientific perspective, right? To not have proven that it's not right is not a reason to label it.
Well, and I would argue the same thing about some of the other stuff that has to go on the labels here in Vermont, like the psychosis warning. I think a lot of that shit is overblown. And they're like, hey, if your kid eats some edibles, call the poison control center. Like, that's not poison. Like, why isn't that same labeling on a bottle of alcohol? Hey, if your kid gets this, you should fucking call someone because this is actual poison. So that would be my counterpoint there.
Well, and that's no, it's the same. It's actually the exact same point. It's exactly the same point. So I am all about having the conversation about some of the trade-offs of cannabis and some of the potential dangers. And I am not prepared to say that it doesn't cause any harm to any human being. There's no such thing. I mean, truly, everything has trade-offs. That is the nature.
I've seen people get super paranoid off of too many edibles. It's happened to me a couple of times, so that definitely is a possibility. Although I think that a lot of the messaging around that is overblown, in my opinion. Yeah,
exactly. So we haven't proven that cannabis does not cause psychosis. And so therefore we're going to put a label that says we haven't proven that this doesn't cause psychosis. Now, that's not how labeling works. The way labeling works is it says we have shown with strong evidence through double-blind controlled studies over years that there is actually a relationship between this molecule and this potential effect. And if it's enough across populations to show that it is significant and it can potentially, as a public policy matter, cause harm, then put the damn label on there. But at the end of the day, right, it's limited real estate. So what we are actually using that real estate to actually communicate is important. Now, I say again, if you want to give all of the information to the consumer, I'm all for it. QR
I
code, give the
I
full
I would.
panel, give
Yeah,
everything.
let me ask you this, man. If you bought a jar of weed from a dispensary, would you want to know if it was remediated or not?
Me personally, I
Yes.
mean, honestly, I wouldn't care personally because I know I have looked at the science and there is absolutely, let me rephrase this. So I've looked at the science and what I have seen is that while there may be some so for example, you look at the work of uh, uh, Sherman Ohm, right? Um,
From
and
medical genomics.
medical genomics, yes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so they published an article where they conjecture that it may be that after remediation, you may see failures for specific microbe testing at a future date. And they conjecture of why that is. Now,
I've heard that as well. Yeah.
okay. Now, to then say that that may be a cause of some future harm that we can't possibly, that we don't know, and therefore you need a label. Again, it's a few steps, right? And so, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, this is it's an important conversation, and it's
Yeah.
ongoing, and
It
one
was
that
a
I'm
good
always.
that was a good question, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was, it was, it was a
Yo, and
very good question.
I did read I believe the paper was by a guy named Frink, which was a study about rad source remediation, X-ray remediation on cannabis, where they were trying to see if it affected the terpene profile at all. And they said that they didn't really see a noticeable decline in the terpene profile, although they did also acknowledge that it was a small sample size. But I would love to see some more research on that as well. And Broxterman, if you're listening, you still owe me an interview. I'd love to have you guys on the show. George Terry, if you're listening, yeah, I think that'd be a great show. And this is, I think, one of the most fascinating topics in cannabis, along with the testing. I think these are really important things to consider.
Yeah, yeah, and I've experienced the same. Again, anecdotal. What I would say is the evidence. We need more evidence, and I want to see more. And if somebody comes forward with something that is actually showing harm, then you know, then we should address that. But it comes back to again the it's. I take this to be a continuation of the hangover from prohibition, and what I mean is this: we realized and had to admit that cannabis is benign, right? As far as intoxicants go, we have tried very hard to show that it's this evil devil's lettuce, and we couldn't do it. At best, we can show, well, if you're predisposed for psychosis, you might want to be careful, especially with edibles, right? And for example, and if you have respiratory and autoimmune deficiencies, then you should be careful about inhaling aspergillus into your lungs. And that's true across the board, right? No matter how you ingest it. Now, what we've also seen is that's a higher risk if you're not combusting flower, but you're vaping flower, it's a higher risk. So combustion does seem to kill most of it, especially when it comes to, healthy lungs. Um, but, I mean, I think, um, well, we're kind of harping on this. This is an important conversation, no doubt.
Yeah, that's why I
Um,
got you on the show, man.
okay.
No,
Yeah.
and and I love to hear everyone's different takes because honestly, like I said earlier, I didn't even know this technology existed, and well, I guess I knew it existed. I didn't know people were using it for cannabis until I went to Vegas a year and a half ago for
Yeah,
MJ BizCon. And
yeah,
you know, finding out about it was fascinating. I love to nerd out. I have a physics degree from an engineering school. I like to get nerdy. And
not
so reading about this and that Frink paper, I think was really helpful. And I really love to see. It's unfortunate that people can't get money to do research on stuff like this.
right,
You know,
right. And that's, and the truth is we need research. And I'm all for having the conversation in a good faith conversation. What I have found, the heuristic, we've talked about this, the heuristic I use, I would not put something into the market that I personally would not consume with people that I love. Simple
mm,
as that. And so you asked what I want it to be, what I want to know if it was remediated. I mean, at the end of the day, I want to smell it, I want to smoke it. If it's good, that's good. If not, honestly, for me personally, and this is just me, I would much rather know what are the fertilizers that were used. Was this grown in rock wool? What was the waste that comes with it? That's what I would want to know, right? Was this chemical? Was it salt fertilizer? Was this organic and living soil? Was it grown in the sunshine? Right now, what I also do believe is that I can tell. Now, everyone says that, but it's set and setting, right? But I also just feel better if it was sun and soil grown. But again, that's me. I'm not every consumer, and there is something for everybody. Now, again, when it comes to these conversations, it really comes down to cannabis is benign, and that includes all of the thousands of species of bacteria and fungus that have been co-evolving along with cannabis for thousands of years that we've been smoking, combusting, putting into various forms and consuming, right? With various positive and some trade-offs, right? And that's a fact. Now, to then bring in regulators who don't understand any of this, and because you can't just make it free, you have to somehow protect us. And since we can't really test and we don't exactly know what's causing harm, so what we're going to test for is total yeast mold and total viable aerobic bacteria, right? It's not really telling us anything that's harm, but it's the only thing we have, right? Everything looks like a nail when all you got is a hammer. So we're going to test for it, and then we're going to say that it fails. But ultimately, if we accept that as the basic framework, then ultimately we have to accept the basic position that indoor, synthetically grown, in fertilizers, in a sterile environment, under artificial lights, is better for health and public safety than outdoor, organic, biologically grown cannabis. And that's
mm,
just not a position that makes any sense to me. But that's what, if you take the entire framework, including the microbe testing thresholds, and you take them at face value, and you don't challenge the underlying assumptions or lack of assumptions, lack of forethought, then that's what you're accelerating. And so, ultimately, again, the way I look at all of this comes downstream from how do we make outdoor sun and soil cannabis viable in a free market?
mm. And how do you think we do that? So let me ask you, this is a question I ask a lot of my guests. I say, hey, if you could rewrite the legislation yourself, what would you change, or what would you keep the same, or what would you throw away?
Um, okay,
Great question, Caleb.
great question, Caleb. All right. Well, what I would do, let's just take New York. What I would do is, when it comes to microbe testing thresholds, I would say test for everything and just report. No action level, no pass fail. Test and report. So you have to do a full panel, and just like you have to, you have to actually report what is the THC, what is the cannabinoid. Now, it also should be that this is not required to be labeled. You don't have to put THC on the front. You have to just put it on a COA and make it available to everybody if they want to see it, right? So we've done the full panel across everything we possibly can test, and then let the consumer do the research on what should they be concerned about. Okay. So therefore, eliminate all the microbe remediation. All right. So just based on transparency and communication. Okay. Then what I would do is, in New York, for example, I would allow a canopy. So again, my interest is the intersection of cannabis and farms. So I would allow a canopy for outdoor cultivator on farm that is a ratio of the total vegetable and fruit canopy. So let me pause for a second and make sure that that made sense there to you. In other words, if I have 10 acres, then I would have it be such that a cultivator in one of those, in let's call it New York, can grow up to, let's say, 1 acre of cannabis, or if they have 100 acres and it's up to 10 acres, et cetera. So that's one of the things that I would also do. And I would give those licenses and the incentives for outdoor cultivators to do that. Um, and then I would actually provide some of the resources and treat cannabis as an agricultural crop in these states, both New York and Massachusetts, so that all the zone, because one of the biggest problems that outdoor cultivators face, especially in Massachusetts, is the local zoning restrictions. And so that's really what winds up precluding it. So, for example, in Massachusetts, most farms are in residential areas, and in almost all municipalities, you can only grow in industrial manufacturing, right? You can't grow in residential. So that precludes from farmers from doing it. So that's another thing. Um, and then, some of the testing protocols across the board, just do away with this fear mongering nonsense. Like, for example, in Massachusetts, you got to test the soil for an outdoor farmer. Let's just plan to be testing the letter of what the soil testing is required in Massachusetts. You're talking somewhere 400, 500,000, minimum 100,000 in testing of soil every season, just alone. Then you got to test the water if you're not using municipal water. I would say do away with all that. And again, test for what is actually in the finished product, and then be more careful on pass fail, right? In other words, make it so that you have to report it and then let the consumer determine whether or not those are the things that they're concerned about.
Well, and great point there too. And I also think it would be fun to sell weed without the THC numbers on there. But I'm having a stoner moment. I just really, that's a great point. And, I think that a lot of consumers don't really understand what they're looking for. And maybe a lot of this marketing has been towards high THC percentages or massive terpene numbers. And, I think it would be fun to do a blind taste test where you just had to sell people weed in a jar and let them smell it and take it home and see how that hits them.
Exactly.
Yeah. How has your relationships been with the labs? Have you had any weird interactions with labs, or has that gone smoothly for you?
Honestly, labs have been my greatest allies.
Huh.
Again, MCR, I got a great relationship with them. Same in New York. Everyone's just trying to figure this out. And there's a bunch of protocols. There's very little when it comes to consistency and standards and even technology and how and who's doing what. And in tests along the same batch, whether you're talking harvest batch or production batch. And so it's all over the place. But this is the law we were given, right? And this is the framework we were given. Again, if you asked if I could rewrite it, what were the things I would do? Well, I would say still test, but this action level of pass fail is nonsense. But then what we would start to see is labs would also be in competition. So it would be based on accuracy potential instead of just, highest numbers. And so the incentive structure itself would change. But when it comes down to it, there's human beings are what they are, and the incentives are what they are. And labs have the incentives that they have, and they are in business to get business. And so what you start to see is labs somehow, maybe all of the cannabis across Massachusetts, THC just happens to be eking up in THC every year because of the genetics program, or maybe there's an incentive built in there, and the labs just are tending upwards because that's what gets them business.
Maybe.
Now, again, I have great relationships with them. So, and
Well,
I will say, the interactions I've had have always been good, honest. Yeah.
I know I've met a lot of great guys at labs, who have told me about some of the shady other shit that's going on at other labs. However, I got a couple more for you here, and then we're gonna wrap this up. Um, I am rambling a little, but something you mentioned to me on the phone was about the breakdown of the financials involved in the business aspect here with the taxes and the delivery. And you talked about brand loyalty. I was wondering if you'd run us through that a little bit. And, like the little, yeah, I don't know. I describe it as death by 1,000 cuts. Um, in this business where there's just hidden costs and fees at every corner, it seems like.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the what I would, there's a world in which I believe, we can go, and I think New York is setting the stage as potential. It's not a foregone conclusion. Massachusetts, I think the time is right for various reasons. When you look at a lot of the characteristics in the Massachusetts market, but ultimately, I would like to see a very diverse network of outdoor cultivators um, that are integrated through large scale processor hubs, right? And then on through to a brand marketing, sales, distribution. All right. And I think what you're referring to is I look at that in a holistic fashion, right? So it's not just the cultivator, it's not just the brand marketing and sales, it's not just the extraction or the packaging, but understood. To you, the way you talk about it is death. Would death by a thousand slices? Is that what you said? Well,
1,000 cuts, yeah, yeah.
thousand cuts, yeah. So what I want to see is clarity of those cuts and then life throughout the supply chain because it's understood holistically. Okay.
So,
So
so if you know how bad you're going to get cut, just tell me, and that'll be all right. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So
Okay.
you take New York, take New York, for example. All right. If I have a $10 unit, then I know for the THC tax in New York, a $10 unit, 20% of that off the top, 20 or 30% off the top is going to be THC tax to the state at the distribution level. All right.
That's that potency tax.
Potency tax in New York. Yep. Yep.
Stupid.
That's at wholesale. That's before it gets to retail. Prices, let's call it doubled, right? Keystone. And then you add on all the excise, cannabis tax on top of that at the retail level, right? So it's huge. But back up. So now of that $10 unit, I've got $8 left. And what I'm proposing is that understood as a holistic, supply chain, um, there is a big conversation that I'm seeing happening in New York right now about the brands, right? And how out of state brands are coming and taking market share. All right. But the way I look at it, I'm agnostic. So I say, for example, if we could create a low cost outdoor cultivation network that allowed us to grow cannabis up to the day of harvest, and including true costs under $150 per pound for the flower. And that's doable. That is doable. I promise you that. It's not easy, but it's doable. Up to the day of harvest, $150 a pound. And then you build an infrastructure on top of that where, with high volume, high efficiency throughput processor, you can then take all of that flour, convert it into the raw material inputs, and then all those raw material inputs into finished goods. Then looking at that $8, now round it up, let's say a THC tax goes away and you take a $10 unit, right, at wholesale. What I'm proposing is that 25 to 35% of that $10 unit, you have to be prepared that that is going to be an expense that goes towards brand marketing, sales, and distribution, including all of the samples, right? Returns, rebates, refunds, all the other adjustments, 25 to 35%. Then
Are you
another,
required? Can I ask you a question? Are you required to do to run your product through a wholesaler in New York? Um, I know in some states that you have to do that. In Vermont, people are allowed to just drive their weed around themselves if they want to. They have to have a
yeah,
manifest and all that shit. But I'd be curious about how the delivery works there.
yeah, New York, you have it's basically they're calling it a two-tier, but it's really a three-tier system. So you've got the production, cultivation, and you've got the processor license, and then you got the distributor license and a retail license. So the way New York works, only a distributor license can sell to a retailer. Only a processor can sell to a distributor, and a cultivator can only sell to a processor.
Wow. So a cultivator can't sell to a retailer
Distributor.
directly.
No, no.
Wow.
It can't even sell to a distributor directly. It's got to sell to a processor license first.
Wow.
Yep.
That seems very unfortunate for the farmers.
Well, and this is again, so this is what I was getting at, or this was the conversation. Yes, that's true. In some respects. Now there are what's in New York called a micro license, which allows you to be vertically integrated all the way
What
through.
is can you tell us the details of a micro license real quick?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's basically, restricted in its total output, the amount that you can buy. I don't know. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's under 10,000 square feet for canopy. And then you can process, so do all the processing activities, which includes all the packaging, the labeling, all the extractions, right? All the formulations, all of that stuff, and then final pack. And then you can also sell at retail, so you can be vertically integrated. But you can
So
only own that license. What's that?
the micro license gives you all of those.
Yes, but very
Okay.
limited in your right. So there's a very strict cap on your scale,
Hmm.
right?
Although
Um,
that would be bigger than most of the biggest grows here in Vermont. So
sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Totally. But what I propose here, and this is kind of so remember what I was saying was I would love to see a large network of outdoor cultivators that are focused just on the cultivation up to the day of harvest. And then all of the infrastructure, all of the equipment, all of the labor, all of the organization that would go into all of the post-harvest processing, the extraction, the consumer packaged goods, the sales, the marketing, and the distribution, they stay away from. They just focus on the cultivation and then integrate that into processor. Now, there's a few pieces into there, but understood in that context. See, what I propose is for an outdoor cultivator, in order to hit the economies of scale, or let me rephrase that, eventually, what we will see is that agricultural economics drives the cannabis market. Okay. And so, what I believe, and I think this is sort of a tacit assumption, is consolidation of certain functions will happen just like you see in agriculture, right? You see processor, right? Hubs.
It's already happening.
It's
Yeah.
already happening. It's already happening. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of who and where does this consolidation happen. Now, what I propose is the world I would like to see are these large scale processor hubs. Imagine them being worker owned. Imagine those worker owned processor hubs being in communities of disproportionate impact. Imagine that bringing manufacturing jobs to these communities that were disproportionately impacted. Now, imagine those processor hubs are providing a service to cultivators, and all the cultivators have to focus on is the cultivation. And then they can interface through these processor hubs and bring their products to market. Now, of that number, remember the $10 in the wholesale price? Of that, 10% of that goes to the brand marketing, to the brand, to the royalty, to these big bad brands that are taking, but that's only 10% of that slice. And what I'm proposing is that is a very expensive and difficult and high risk proposal. And if you want to do all of the growing and all of the packaging and all of the brand marketing and sales, and you want to do that all within the scale of 10,000 square foot canopy, and you want to also be able to compete and get the efficiency so that your cost per unit is low enough that you can compete with somebody who's got $1 million in packaging equipment, right? Just to put the labels on the thing, right? Who can do it at a fraction of what you can do. And then let's say you're successful at all of that somehow, and you get the shelf space, but you've got 10,000 square foot, and then you outgrow your canopy. Then you have an additional problem of how you're going to scale and get additional resources. Because I promise you this, you may have the firest cannabis, you may be the most regenerative farmer, you may be the womanist ownedest farmer out there. But if you lose that inventory on that shelf space, they don't care. The retailer is not going to wait for you for next season or next harvest. So by having this,
That's true.
this, by having everybody working, see, I think one of the problems that we face in this industry is I propose that the only way this works is if we all work together. Now, not all, but what I mean is outdoor cultivators or regenerative craft cultivators, right? Work together and then integrate into various processors so that there is a stable market. Now, I would like to see a guild formed for outdoor cultivators. And so with that guild, right, there are various value adds that could potentially come out of this, not the least of which is a third-party certification, a communication to the consumer of certain practices, certain standards, and then a collective bargaining power that is then taken to a processor, enter into with a stable supply, which then, if there is a brand that comes out of that, then you can sort of not worry about the middle, but then go to the brand. See, I'm brand agnostic, truly. I don't know which is going to be the brand that finally wins. But what I do want to see is a little more clarity and a little more honesty. If you are in it because you truly love to cultivate and you want to grow, then I think there's a way to focus on that. But if you truly, really secretly want to be a celebrity and you want to be actually in the limelight because you are, you believe that you have a message to tell and that you are the ones who are going to communicate to the consumer, then focus on that. But to do both under the scale of 10,000 square feet, what I promise you is in a sea of individual micro licenses, Pareto distribution will happen. You're setting up for 80% of the people who try that to fail. Some will work, some will succeed, no doubt. But there is a world in which there's actually a way that there is an aggregation, right? And that we can take what we've seen in other sectors in agriculture and feed off of that. And what we see a time and time again in agriculture is we see aggregation, worker cooperatives, marketing cooperatives, processor cooperatives. You have to get to the economies of scale, the large scale processor through the high volume, high efficiency, or else eventually you're just going to get crushed when CPG continues to come into this market.
Well, and we also see in the ag industry is, a lot of the same consolidation and a move
Right.
towards these massive factory farming operations. And, I think a lot of people's concerns are that maybe we'll see that exact same thing in the cannabis industry here.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm proposing is we will. The question is, what is the shape of it? Right.
Exactly. It's like, well, when and what will it look like?
Exactly. So there's a world in which imagine that the consolidation at the processor level becomes worker owned. Large scale processors worker owned. But then hundreds, thousands of individual craft small scale cultivators who have not spent the resources to build out all the infrastructure for the packaging, the brand marketing, the sales, the distribution. They have not done that. But they have the interface with a ethical, open book, transparent processor hub that provides a service on a clear margin, just like any other place in agriculture, right? Where then provides the service and converts their product into finished consumer packaged goods. And then if they want to also then be the spokesperson and the salesman and be the IG model, they can do that too, but they don't have to build that all into it, right?
What if farmers just did that all themselves? And
A
I've
lot
seen in
try.
different states, in some states, I see you're required to run it through a processor. And even in Vermont, we had some weird rules where like you're not even allowed to process your own keef
Yes.
if you have a cultivator license, which I thought was kind of silly. Like you had to get a manufacturing license to process your own keef. And I thought that was maybe just a bit of overkill. Any thoughts on
Yeah.
that idea?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think in a particular instance that can work. And we see that. Again, I take the example from agriculture, small scale farms, and we see it, right? But remember, I got in this because I'm interested in there's something fundamentally broken with our agricultural system in the United States, right? It's
Facts.
fucked up. It's fucked up, right? And it's fucked up. And it's, I won't say it's a conspiracy by design, but at the end of the day, it is fundamentally broken. And I do also believe that the so-called traditional farming practices, right, which really just amounts to a close accountability with the local ecology, right? That's what ultimately I would mean by regenerative or traditional farming practices. But I do believe, and a lot of this is conjecture because there's not a lot of research and it's hard to find, but there's lots of reason to believe that that type of farming is better for your health, for the ethics, and for the ecology, right? Now, it's very, very, very difficult to make that work. And so we see various strategies. One is the direct to consumer local market, but that only works in very small areas and it doesn't work all the time.
Right?
It works sometimes.
Maybe a small area like Vermont.
Exactly. Exactly. There is
And
no
a lot
one size fits all, right? There's no
well,
such thing.
a lot of and sorry to interrupt you, man,
No,
but a
please.
lot of people here have been talking to me about that direct to consumer model. Like, hey, why can't we sell this at a farmer's market where they're selling alcohol and other, well, I don't want to say other things, but they're selling alcohol. So why can't a farmer roll up to a farmer's market and sell their weed there?
And that's one strategy. And there's no doubt. And at the end of the day, you know, so my farming experience and development, and I am by no means a master expert at anything. Okay.
Yeah.
So what I can say is that we'll start with that Green Gulch. For 2 years, I lived at Green Gulch, and for the second year I was there, I ran the farmers market. And the way that business worked was we had the farmers market down at the south. What was it? The South Shore. I forget what it's called now. Wow, Southport, but down in San Francisco, one of the biggest farmers markets in the world. But that wasn't our only business. We also had restaurant accounts, right, where we would send produce to restaurants and some shops. And it was interesting, right? One of the things that struck me was that a probably 1/16 of our farm, which was our salad greens, was about 80% of our revenue, right? So high end salad greens to restaurants, all right. And so that was a strategy. And one of the things that absolutely was required for this business to work was to convince 8 to 12 middle class white kids that it's good for their soul to work for free. Okay. And if you don't have that, then you fail. Right. And so I was thinking, okay, well, that's cool. I mean, I like that. That's great. And yes, you want to integrate the education and all of this. And it is good for your soul to work on a farm, no doubt. Everybody should. But what I would like to see is farmers who also are able to take breaks sometimes and are also able to pay their employees well. And that's a challenge which is extremely difficult, right? And so that's where, for me, if we can take cannabis and we can go to a farm, 78, almost 8,000 farms in Massachusetts, right? 10 times that, and I forget how many in New York, millions of acres. And we say to a farmer, okay, you've been growing these crops for food, and check this out. As long as you continue to grow food, we will give you X% of your canopy to grow cannabis. And now, all of a sudden, instead of getting 10 to 30,000 gross revenue per acre, you can now get 500,000 to $1 million in revenue from this one crop, as long as you keep it diversified in the ecology, right? And so now, you sort of change that dynamic, and you have now offered an opportunity for growers. But if you then tell that farmer, well, okay, but you also have to figure out how you're going to compliantly can package this. By the way, wait till you get to the point of the total yeast mold and total viable fucking aerobic bacteria. Good luck with that. Hopefully you'll figure it out when you get there. So you're going to have to figure out how to grow it compliantly, get it packaged, then figure out how to create the relationship with the retail, then figure out how to distribute it, sell it. Okay, well, all this makes sense, and this could be possible. And if you have a local economy and you live in a community where the culture is such that you can get direct to consumer, so a lot of that is, a lot of those steps are cut out. That's fantastic. But what I'm talking about is the potential for systems change in New York. New York is going to be $3 billion market within the next, let's call it 3 to 4 years. And then shortly after that, we are going to hit $6 billion market. And I'm not talking about just some farmers succeeding just by sheer will and determination and incredible ingenuity and luck, but potential to actually create a lasting, sustainable market that when federal prohibition goes away, that when we are in competition, that we have the cost structure, a diversified cultivation network that allows us to produce sophisticated consumer packaged goods with sophisticated messaging and marketing and sales and distribution, so that once you get that shelf space, you keep it. And we're talking about for billions of dollars, not for a few $100,000 every year sparsed in between here and there. Now, again, that will happen, and I all the power to anybody who wants to do that. But I think that if you look at the basic economics and you take that that basic economics, I believe, is true no matter what. Now, unless you have a very, very vibrant local economy and a local consumer who will come to your doorstep, and buy your raw milk at a huge premium so that you can potentially pay for your tractor. Like, okay, yeah, but that is not going to actually change our agricultural system, in my opinion.
Mm. And my last question kind of ties into this, and you mentioned federal legalization. So, and I want to thank you again. And you actually, before I do that, can I do this? There was a comment a while ago, and sorry, I got wrapped up in the conversation. CLJ Music, thoughts on legalization of weed in New Hampshire? I have a couple. Do you have any, Suehiko?
Uh, I think it should be legal everywhere, and it's just complete ethical travesty that it's illegal anywhere. I have to say, I have not followed New Hampshire closely enough to really have an opinion specific to that.
Well, I'll tell you, I've read an article where Sununu, and I think Sununu's out now, but he was saying we should just franchise it like McDonald's. And I thought that was the worst possible fucking approach ever.
Yeah.
But yeah, descheduling versus rescheduling. Any thoughts on that? That seems to be a hot button issue right now too.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, going back to one of the earlier things I said, what interests me about cannabis is the intersection of the end of prohibition and cannabis cultivation on local farms, right? Because that intersection brings up downstream, very, excuse the pun, organically, a lot of very important conversations. So, for example, excuse me, the end of prohibition. Now, the prohibition, we live in a culture right now where there's like a pendulum swing back and forth, right? And I am not one to believe and to read into, while I do understand this perspective, especially from the lived experience of somebody who has lived it. But I don't see that every ill in our society can be understood in terms of racism. However, there are some things in our history which are brutally racist and fucked up. And the Controlled Substance Act is one of those. That is absolutely blatant and unequivocal. So when you look at that history and you look at all of the information that has been disclosed now about the conversations around the Controlled Substance Act and the way that they looked at it and realized, wow, this is actually benign, but this is a way for us to criminalize the behavior of certain populations. And you look at that, and then you look at the devastation that it's been creating throughout cultures and populations throughout the United States. That's an important conversation. And while not everything in society is racism, that sure as fuck is, right? So to me, the end of prohibition is about first just admitting, wow, this was a fucked up racist policy. It is a completely benign plant, and in most cases causes far more positive benefit to society, to culture, to spiritual well-being than it causes harm to the people that it does cause harm. And there are people it harms, I'm sure. But there is no world in which this should not be free for the individual to determine that they can consume this, that they can grow it, that they can sell it, right? Within the bounds of ethical goodwill. Now, am I a fan of all these stores in New York that are basically just completely irresponsibly opening up unlicensed, illegal, and like selling candy and selling weed to kids in New York. No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Oh yeah, and that's what I wanted to slap up here. Now I got you. You know, had a great conversation with Jenny RG the other day about the lawsuit that she filed against the OCM for what she described as maybe targeted enforcement when there's all of these other shops, which she says they know are bringing in products from out of state and breaking a number of rules, which makes you wonder why have rules at all if you're not going to enforce them.
Yeah. Well, for one, I think it's not really the OCM's responsibility to shut down illegal stores. That's law enforcement. And really, that should really come from what we've seen how to do it. And you just go after the landowners. Now, why are they not doing that? That's a good question, right? I think that there should, you don't see illegal liquor stores. You don't see restaurants without without approval from the health department. You just don't see that, right? And so, we'll get it under control. Now, when it comes to the OCM's enforcement, it's an interesting question, right? Because they have been very lax in their enforcement across the board. And, to my point, I said this earlier, it's going to be interesting how we see them sort of put the cat back in the bag. But, I think there's definitely, I'm all about, like I said, I think there's no world in which it should be illegal. But that's different than saying you should open up on every street corner and sell cannabis, to kids along with lollipops, right?
Hey man, check this out. I hate to cut this short, but I just realized I'm about to reach my limit of streaming on StreamYard. I only have 50 hours, but I do, and I apologize for that. But I want to give you the last word here real quick. I got like 5 minutes left before it's going to cut this off. I want to thank you, Suehiko Ono. A pleasure having you on the show. If you have any shameless plugs, shout outs, or anything we missed real quick, now is the time. Thank you so much. I apologize for this, but otherwise we're just going to get cut off. But thanks again. Pleasure having you on the show.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Caleb. This has been fun, and you do a great job. I really appreciate you. You certainly have a perspective and opinion, but I also, you're a good listener and a good question asker. And in this day and age, it's an extremely valuable resource. So I appreciate it. I definitely said a few things that I'm sure a lot of people, if they're listening to this, are going to disagree with, and I'm always open to good faith dialogue. I've made many mistakes. I've said things that are wrong. But here's what I am, less interested in. People on the sidelines who aren't doing it and saying what they would have done or should have done from some, pure idealistic perspective. It's a very challenging industry. And everyone who's, my hat's off to anyone who's even giving it an attempt. So that's the first thing. Now, I'll repeat what I said, which is that you can understand everything that I say and do about this industry in terms of my interest in the intersection of cannabis and local agriculture. I do believe, and I've written about this, you can look at my Substack, How to Save New York Cannabis Farms. But what I would like to see is for particular outdoor and greenhouse farm-based cannabis cultivators in New York. I will help you in any way that I can. That's an honest offer. But more importantly, more specifically, I'm interested in creating a guild. And a guild, which is a aggregation of outdoor cultivators that are interested in a certification based on the underlying practices. We'll call it regenerative agriculture, but regenerative more broadly, which includes how you treat your workers. And then to be able to aggregate into a group to create a set of principles, a set of best practices, a set of genetics, which would be a big part of this, and all the consumer-facing education around all of the conversations and issues with outdoor and sustainable cannabis cultivation on farms. So my email is in this. Reach out. I'm open to all conversations.
Excellent. Yeah, and I hate to cut this short, but we're just going to get cut off here in a minute. But Suehiko Ono, thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to sign it off. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey. Remember, the devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print. Peace.